Automation. So in today's session we will see how to use .gitignore file and what is the benefit of .gitignore file. So .gitignore file is a special file used in Git to specify files or directories that Git should ignore. So let me just present this. Yeah, so what is exactly .gitignore file is, let's say when we are working on project, there are multiple type of files which we create, and all of those files are not required to push to local repository or remote repository. For example, there can be some files which are log files, or there are some files which are sensitive files which contain some password, or let's say which contain some confidential credentials, etc. Or let's say there are some files which are system generated files which we don't need in our local repository or remote repository. So we don't have to commit those files into our staging area or remote repository. So how to tell Git that these files are not needed, or we should ignore these files to be committed in local repository or remote repository. So git ignore file is a special file used in Git to specify files or directories that Git should ignore. Suppose in our project we have some folder, and from that folder whatever files are present inside that folder, we don't want those files to be committed. We don't want that Git should consider those files while adding it into staging area or while committing those files. So it is particularly useful for excluding the files that should not be tracked by Git. If you want that Git should not track some files, then we can use .gitignore file. Files such as temporary files, log files, sensitive information, or compiled binary files, etc. So .gitignore file will help us to exclude unnecessary files. It prevents clutter in your repository by ignoring files that are not relevant to the project. Also, it helps to avoid committing sensitive information like API keys, credentials, or configuration files. For example, let's say you are working on some API automation project and you have written some script which are used for API automation. So you will write some code in it, and in API we have to use some API key sometimes. It can be a token, etc. And those tokens we have to place in some file. Now it is very risky to commit these files in remote repo because anyone can see if your repository is public. So we should not track such files which contains API keys. Or let's say while you are working on some test automation script, you have some username and password. Those username and password you have stored in some specific file. Now it's a good practice that we should not push those files in remote repository which contains some sensitive information like credentials, etc. Or there can be some configuration files which are not relevant to push into remote repo or even in local repo. So we should not track such files. So we can use .gitignore file for such exclusion of files to be tracked. Also, it will help to optimize the repository size. For example, let's take a module. So in your project, you have some module called node_modules that contains some of the files which are not relevant for any project related work. Those are not relevant to be committed into local repo or remote repo. That might contain some large files which will unnecessarily increase the size of our repository. So we can take the help of .gitignore file to tell the Git that which files should not be tracked or which files should be ignored while performing different Git operations. Then question comes how to use .gitignore. So how to use .gitignore file. So first step is we have to create a .ignore file in your project. So whatever project you are working upon, at the root of your Git repository, we have to create a file named .gitignore. After that, we have to specify the files or directories to ignore. That I will show you. So basically, we can specify the files or some pattern for the files which need to be ignored. And then we have to add that .gitignore file to staging area, and we have to commit that file to your repository. So how it will work is Git will read the pattern in the .gitignore file and it will skip the tracking of those specified files. We can use wildcard support like star to match multiple files. For example, in .gitignore file, if you specify star.log, if you specify this extension, for example, star.log, it will ignore all .log files to track. It will not track any log file. We can also specify if you have some folder or directory from which we want to exclude all the files. For example, if you have folders called node_modules and whatever files present in this folder, you don't want to track those files. So we can also exclude such files as well by mentioning node_modules / dot option. We can also add some comments in our .gitignore file by using hash. So let me show you one simple example. So if you see this example here, let's say you have created .gitignore file in your Git project, and in this you have added this content. For example, hash is for comment. So let's say I want to ignore all the log files to be tracked. I don't want to add or I don't want to track any log file in my repository. So I will just mention the rule like this. I can mention the pattern like this, star.log. So this will exclude all the .log files from to be committed or to be tracked. If you want to ignore all the files present in node_modules directory, we can mention the pattern like this, node_modules, that is the folder name, and /. It will ignore all the files from this folder. If you want to ignore some temporary files, you can mention like this, star.tmp, star.swp. So files with this extension will be ignored. If you want to ignore some environment configuration files, .env files which you don't want to track, then we can use .env. Similarly, we can ignore .exe, .dll files, or even if you want to ignore some specific file. For example, let's say I have one file called secrets.txt in my project which contains some password, and I don't want to track that file. I don't want Git to be commit those file or to add those file in staging area. So what I will do, I will just mention that file name secrets.txt, and this file will be ignored by Git. It will not track those files. So overall, this will help to keep the repository clean, and it will avoid exposing the sensitive data and prevents tracking files that are auto-generated or irrelevant to the project. So now let me show you one simple example. So I have just created one new folder called my_project_h. In this folder, I am just going to add some files. So first I will add one file called as abcd.txt. Let's say this is our file which contains some code. So let's say this is the file. This file contains my project code. Saving this file. So this is the file which I have created in my project_h folder. After that, I will create one more file. Let's say secrets.txt file. And this file, let's say, contains some passwords. Let's assume this contains some password and confidential information. Along with that, let's create one more file. Let's create one new folder. So I am creating one folder called config folder. And inside this config folder, I am adding some files. Let's say config1.txt, which is added inside config folder. Along with that, let's create some more file. For example, I will create one log file. Let's say log file 1.log. So I have created one log file. I'm just copying this file. Let's copy this. So another log file also. There are two log files. I'm just renaming it. So we have two log files, one normal abcd.txt file and one secrets.txt file. We have one directory, or we can say one folder, config folder, which contains one config file. Now what I want to do is just demonstrate the use of .gitignore. What we will do, whenever we are working on this project, I will add all those files into staging area and I will just commit those files. But when I do such operation, I don't want, apart from this abcd.txt, I don't want any other file should be tracked. I don't want to track any other file apart from abcd.txt to be tracked. I just want to track only abcd.txt, and rest files I don't want to track. Then what we can do is, first we have to create new .gitignore file. So what we have to create is, I'm just creating .gitignore file. So we have to create .gitignore file, and in this file I'm just going to add this content. I'm just copying it and I'm just going to add that content in .gitignore file. So let's open this file. I'm opening this file by using Notepad. In this file I'm just copying this content. So this is basically comment which we are adding. Star.log means all the .log files will be ignored, those will not be tracked. Here we can configure. So if you want to avoid the config folder or config directory, so I'm just mentioning, let's say I want to avoid the config directory to be tracked. So I can simply mention like this, config. So I'm just editing this .gitignore file. To ignore all the log files, I have to add star.log. Star is a wildcard character. I am mentioning config and slash. It will ignore the files inside the config folder. Along with that, let's say this part you can keep whatever extension you want to exclude, we can mention like this. So this is, I'm just removing now. So let's say .env file, if you want to exclude, then it will exclude env files as well. Also, let's say compiled binaries, this again if you want to exclude, you can exclude those. And specific file, if I want to specifically mention that secrets.txt should be ignored, that also I don't want to track. So I'm just mentioning that file name, secrets.txt. Then we have to just save this file. So I'm saving .gitignore file. And next step is, we have to add that .gitignore file to staging area. And then we have to add that file to local repository as well. So I'm just opening git bash here. But first, we haven't created any local repository yet. So I haven't created any local git repository yet. So how to create a local, initialize the local git repo by using git init command. So after pressing git init, it has now initialized empty Git repository in our project. Now we have to add dot git ignore file first. So let's add dot git ignore file to staging area, and then commit that file git commit -m committing dot git ignore file. So we have to commit that dot git ignore file. So that file will tell the Git that which files should not be tracked by giving patterns which we have mentioned in dot git ignore file. Now I'm going to add all the files from this project into staging area. So let's say I'm using command git add dot and then git commit -m. I'm just committing the files. So now we have added. So git add dot command adds all the files to staging area, and we have committed all the changes to local repo. Now, ideally, if you haven't used git ignore, then all the files will be tracked into staging area. But now, since we have mentioned in git ignore that which files to be committed and which files should not be tracked. So in the rules, what we have said, in the rule, if you see .git ignore file, .log files should be ignored, config folder file should be ignored, .env should be ignored, .exe, .dll file should be ignored, along with that secrets.txt file should be ignored. So this file should not be tracked in staging area. So now if you see git status, what it will show? It will only show the abcd.txt file changes. Because we have already committed, that's why changes are not there. Or we can simply check by using git ls -files command. If you see git ls -files is showing only .git ignore and abcd.txt. So only these two files are tracked. Apart from these two files, rest of the files are not tracked in our project. So only these two files are currently tracked. So that is the benefit of using .git ignore file. So whatever rules we have said, as per that only abcd.txt is tracked along with .git ignore, but rest of the files like config files, log files, secrets.txt file will not be tracked. Even if you make some changes in it, let's say I am just making some random changes in log files, let's save it. In secrets.txt also, let's make changes. I am just adding some new content, random content, saving it. So we have modified these files. But now even if you see git status now, let's say git status, it will show you that nothing to commit because we are not tracking those files. So secrets.txt, log files, or even config folder files, these files are not tracked in Git. So this file will never be committed to local repo, as well as if they are not committed to local repo, that means it will not go to remote repository as well. So that's how we have to use .git ignore file. So that is the main benefit of using .git ignore file. Because while you are working on project, we don't have to commit all the files to remote repo or local repo. We just have to commit only required files. The files which are not necessary, for example, log files or system files like environment files, compiled binary files, or there can be some specific files which contain some sensitive info about credentials, etc. So we should avoid committing those files to remote repository as well. So that's it about .git ignore file. And one small note is the .git ignore file will work only for files not yet tracked by Git. To ignore the files which are already tracked. For example, if you have the project and before adding that git ignore file, if you have already some tracked files, let's say you have some log files which are already tracked, but after that you create the git ignore file, then it will not work for those. For that, we have to first remove them from Git's index. If you want to make those git ignore file rule changes to those files as well which are already tracked, then we have to first remove them from Git's index by using git rm --cached and the file name. So that is a small note around .git ignore file. So let's revise one more time. What is the purpose of .gitignore file is? So this file is specifically used in Git to specify files or directories that Git should ignore. If you want Git should ignore those files, we can use .gitignore file, and we can give the patterns in .gitignore file. For example, if you want to ignore all the log files, you can give star.log. If you want to exclude some files from specific folder or directory, you can give like this with slash. If you want to ignore temporary files, environment files, or even if you want to ignore the specific files, we can give name of that file here. So that's about .gitignore file in Git. So whatever sessions we have done so far, we have completed around 36 sessions. We have covered almost most of the most used Git commands. So if you are a developer or if you are a tester who writes the automation script, and if you go through these sessions, I think that will be enough to start out on any project. And as soon as you start working on real-time project, you will face some scenarios where you will learn more about this command. But even if you go through all these sessions, it will help you to understand and it will help you to explore further things in Git as well. So with this session, we are actually concluding this series. If you have any feedback or if any additional sessions which are required, you can feel free to comment on my videos. So thank you for watching this video. Kindly subscribe to my channel. Share your feedbacks on my channel. It definitely helps me to improve myself as well as create a content which is relevant to all of us and which is helpful to all of us. Keep learning, keep growing. Thank you one more time.